The studio lights burned brighter than usual that afternoon, creating a heavy tension in the air before a single word was spoken. John Kennedy leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable, but his silence said everything. The atmosphere inside the studio felt charged, like a storm was waiting to break open on live television. Viewers at home sensed something was different, though they didn't yet know why. Jessica Tarlov shuffled her papers, her voice unusually soft as she tried to begin the segment. The other hosts exchanged nervous glances, unsure of how the show would unfold. Beneath the surface of friendly debate, weeks of quiet disagreements and unspoken emotions simmered. This was a moment where professional lines blurred with personal feelings. And as the cameras rolled, the entire world was about to witness it. The show had never felt so fragile. For months, tensions had been rising behind the scenes. John had been feeling unheard, his opinions cut short or dismissed in ways that chipped away at his patience. Jessica, on the other hand, had been dealing with her own frustration, feeling as though the emotional cost of daily debate was heavier than anyone understood. They respected each other deeply, but respect didn't always prevent conflict. The producers noticed their smiles becoming tighter, their laughter shorter, the warmth fading into something cold and sharp. The fans could feel it too, although they didn't know the source. Both John and Jessica were proud, passionate, and determined to stand their ground. Yet neither had found a way to communicate the exhaustion eating at them. The stage had become a battlefield disguised as conversation. And today, something would finally give. The topic that ignited the moment was something minor, something ordinary. Yet ordinary things often crack under built-up pressure. They spoke over each other, voices rising faster than they could think. John's tone sharpened, frustration bursting through his practiced calm. Jessica's eyes widened, emotions she had tried to hide spilling out before millions of viewers. The other hosts tried to mediate, but the argument had already taken on a life of its own. It wasn't about the topic anymore. It was about everything unsaid for months. A tremor of pain, disappointment, and fatigue ran beneath each word spoken. Suddenly, Jessica pushed back her chair, unable to steady her voice. She whispered, barely audible, "I can't do this," and stood up. And live on air, she walked off set. Silence choked the studio with an intensity that felt almost physical. John froze, the weight of what had just happened crashing over him. He hadn't meant for this. He hadn't wanted to hurt her. The conversation had spiraled beyond his control, fueled by emotion rather than reason. The hosts stared at him, cameras still rolling, unsure of what to do. John swallowed hard, feeling every heartbeat like a drum in his chest. The viewers at home were stunned, watching in disbelief as the show they knew so well unraveled before their eyes. The producers scrambled behind glass panels, but the damage was done. The moment that followed would be remembered for years. The question was what John would do next. The next commercial break felt endless. John sat alone in the dressing room, staring into the mirror that reflected a man tired down to his bones. He thought about Jessica, her integrity, her conviction, her deep empathy that made every debate personal. He realized his frustration had been less about her and more about his own sense of being lost. He had been pushing himself, working through exhaustion without admitting he needed rest, support, or understanding. And instead of being honest, he had let pressure speak for him. It was in that quiet moment that he understood what had to happen. He needed to step away, not out of defeat, but to rebuild himself. Growth sometimes required leaving places one had outgrown. When the show resumed, John returned to the desk with a calm that felt different, gentler, steadier. He looked directly into the camera, his voice quiet but firm. He spoke not as a television personality, but as a human being. He explained that sometimes people lose themselves in the noise, and sometimes stepping back is the only way to find clarity again. He announced his decision to leave the show, not in anger, but in hope of healing and reflection. The studio was silent, the audience at home speechless. His honesty hung in the air like a confession both painful and freeing. And though his departure shocked many, it felt right. It was a moment of vulnerability rarely seen on live television. Jessica watched the broadcast from her dressing room, tears gathering quietly at the edges of her eyes. She hadn't expected his words nor the sincerity behind them. Her own emotions had been tangled in frustration and exhaustion, and she realized she too had been carrying more than she admitted. She returned to the set after the show ended, finding John standing alone by the exit door. For a moment, they simply looked at each other. No cameras, no audience, no pressure. Just two people who had hurt and cared in equal measure. She apologized, and he did too. Their voices were soft, heavy with shared understanding. This was not about winning or losing. It was about recognizing pain and choosing compassion instead. Their conversation continued long after the studio emptied. They spoke about boundaries, expectations, and the unseen cost of being constantly visible. They talked about how arguments are rarely about the surface issue, but about emotions buried beneath. They acknowledged the need for grace, not only for others but also for themselves. In that quiet exchange, something mended. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough. Enough to leave the conversation with respect rather than resentment. Enough to remember that empathy matters more than being right. Enough to learn that silence and pause can heal what words sometimes break, and enough to walk forward without bitterness. In the weeks that followed, viewers debated what had happened, some taking sides, some expressing concern, others simply shocked. But behind the noise of public opinion, the truth was quieter. John took time for himself, long walks, reading, reconnecting to the world beyond the studio. Jessica found new ways to balance her emotional energy, setting boundaries that protected her peace. The show continued, but it was changed, not worse, simply different. And both John and Jessica emerged stronger, more grounded, more aware of their limits and their worth. Sometimes stepping back is not stepping away from life. It's stepping toward oneself. By the time John appeared again months later as a guest, the reunion was warm and genuine. The audience applauded not because of drama, but because they recognized growth. They saw two people who had walked through conflict and come out kinder, wiser, and more resilient. The moment was simple. No spectacle, no chaos, just mutual respect. And that simplicity made it powerful. It reminded everyone watching that real strength is not in never breaking, but in choosing how to rise when you do. The message lingered long after the screen faded to black.